Hello everyone. Today we are making a screen door with a curved top on Nathan Builds. I am using the straightest grained Douglas fir I could find at my home improvement store. However, right off the bat, I'll tell you that if I did this again, I would have ordered some straight grained fir to avoid some of the knots and chance of warping. Hint, hint. After cutting everything to length with a circular saw and a speed square, I planed each board down to 1 inch thick. I picked 1 inch because it is the thickness of the door that I'm replacing. Then I cut everything down to rough widths. It's a very good idea to build your door larger than you're going to need and then cut it down later to exact fit. This is particularly true if your door is going into an old house, as mine is. I used my Starbond CA glue to stabilize any knots. Now I'll be using pocket holes and epoxy to put everything together. If you wanted to spend some extra time, you could use lap joints or something more sophisticated, and that definitely would be stronger and probably last longer. I've been impressed though how well these pocket holes have held up. It's been at least 4 months and it looks brand new still. If you're interested in this or a cheaper pocket hole jig from Craig, check out the video description and I'll link a couple there. With all the holes cut, I put everything together with a couple of screws. These screws held everything together so I could put the old door on top and trace the top angle. This isn't perfect, it's been about 80 years since this thing was built, so things have warped a little bit and sagged over time. But I was able to get a pretty good trace, and then I drew everything out using some rollers and so forth. This is actually a really easy project if you don't have this curved top, so if you're thinking about building this, I would definitely encourage you to give it a shot. You're going to end up with something that's really nice relative to cost. With the door still together, I used my track saw to remove most of the material for the exterior top angle. You could also use a straight edge and a circular saw for this pretty easily. Then I took that top part off and I cut the inside cuts with my table saw. And I finished with a pull saw to get that last little bit. In addition to pocket holes, I used some Toto Boat epoxy. However, if I did this again, I would have used Toto Boat Thixo epoxy, which is really better suited for this application. My approach still worked, but it was a bit too messy. I just worked my way around the door, holding things in place with a clamp while I drove the screws. I used some dowels to fill all the pocket holes, and then I cut them flush with a pull saw. This door is going to be painted, which is another reason I decided to use pocket holes in the first place, and also why I'm not being too concerned about how messy I am getting with my epoxy. I sanded everything and started the top curve. The biggest challenge on this door is getting it to fit right. The door frame had been warped a bunch over the lifetime, which like I said is about 80 years, so it required quite a bit of measuring, cutting, sanding, measuring, cutting, sanding, etc, etc, etc. I am not showing you most of it here, but that took probably as long as everything else combined. As I adjusted the width of the door, I made sure to remove material from both sides at the same time so that I wouldn't have a lopsided door. On the door side that has the handle, I cut a slight bevel so that it would be easier for the door to close. I relied quite a bit on my sander to freeform the door edge on the top. This was kind of required because it was a bit organic, again due to door warping and changes over time. To try and get things to fit, I created this template to allow me to better create that top form. So I just kept measuring against the door frame and then tracing it to the door, cutting it, trimming it, and etc. And eventually I was able to get it to a point where it would fit, although over time I still had to sand it a little bit more to go for a less snug fit so that over time if things expanded a little bit, it wouldn't cause problems. Then I routed out a 1/2 inch slot that's going to hold the screens and staples, and I squared up the corner edges. The new hinges are a bit larger than the originals, so I just marked out the originals and then I added extra space on the top so that they would stay equidistant. You can chisel to fit the hinges, but I just found that my Bits and Bits white side surfacing bit worked really well with a right angle. I used a chisel at the end to kind of do that final edge work, and it turned out great. I drilled the handle hole using a drill guide, and I'll be reusing the original brass handle, which doesn't have a latch, so it just kind of is a pole, really. I ripped down some pieces of wood that are going to act as the trim to cover up those stapled down screens, and I found that using my pole saw gave me more precision and control to get those really awkward angles for the top of the curve. Then I applied, I think, 3 coats of outdoor rated white gloss paint. At this point, I thought I was close to finished, but unfortunately the hinge side of the door warped quite a bit as I let it sit for a couple of days. I actually debated just starting over, but in a last-ditch effort, I decided to cut down and epoxy a strip of wood to counteract that warping. I intentionally used wood instead of plywood for the insert strip so that it would expand and contract with the rest of the door. With that cut, I then routed out the slot that was going to hold it. Obviously I need a straight reference to re-straighten the board, so I'm using these 2x4s that are really straight underneath. So I poured the epoxy, inserted the new board, and then clamped everything to those straight 2x4s. Alright, so I had to let it cure overnight. Ugh. So we're going to see if this worked out. It should be ready now. Let's see if this actually fixed the problem. All right, let's see if I just wasted my time or not. I was actually surprised how well it worked. It wasn't perfect, but it is straight enough. I took the door over to the frame and I marked the hinge locations on the door frame. Then I chiseled them out and installed the hinges on the door itself. I have quite a lot of experience stretching canvas for paintings, and I found that the same technique works really well with screens. So you just stretch and staple the middle on each side, and then you work from the middle out. Then switch to the opposite side and just work your way around the frame doing that. This really helps to keep the fabric tight and avoid any wrinkles. I used some brad nails to attach to the trim, and then I filled any of those nail holes and cracks with caulk. And then finally, I let that dry and painted over the caulk. I attached the handle. As I said, this is just a pull, there's no latch. And finally, we installed the door on the frame. And of course it still didn't fit, so this was a little bit due to the door warping, but also because the door frame itself was warped. So I spent some more time removing some material on the inner edge with a knife and a lot of sanding. After all of that, I attached the spring and we are finally done. I only agreed to make this door for a neighbor because I thought it would be a challenge, and it definitely was a challenge. If you are building a normal door though, as I mentioned before, and you don't have a warped door frame and the door doesn't warp, this is a really simple project, so get some good wood. Regardless, I think it turned out pretty well, and I'm pleased to report that after about, I think I said 4 to 6 months, I kind of forget, it's still holding up well. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments, subscribe, hit that thumbs up, and all that fun stuff. Really helps out the channel. I appreciate it. Got a lot of really interesting projects coming, some really big things, so keep in touch. But until those come out and the next episode, I'll see you later.